Remember for a moment a meal, a time when someone else made food for you and you felt cared for, fed, nourished. Who did the cooking? What was on the menu? What made that meal so special? The one that stands out for me is lunch in a little house 2 blocks from the sea in Saint-Nazaire in western France, where the River Loire meets the Atlantic. Melville and I were visiting Gilbert, a longtime friend of Melville's parents, and Gilbert made us lunch. He's a working class guy in his 80s. He's widowed and lives on his own. You wouldn't think he knows much about cooking, but he is French. Lunch was 4 full courses. It took a couple of hours. The main item, the pièce de résistance as it were, was locally caught shrimp, which Gilbert had cooked whole in their shells, and he served them with his homemade mayonnaise. Nobody had made mayonnaise for me before. It was one of the most delicious things I had ever tasted. What made that meal so special was that Gilbert knows only a few words of English. Melville speaks a little French, and I don't speak French at all. Gilbert couldn't tell us in words how delighted he was that we were visiting him all the way from America, or how welcome we were in his home. His food had to do the talking. When we finally got up from the table and went for a long walk around Saint-Nazaire, I felt cared for and truly fed, not only in body, but in spirit as well. Thousands of years ago, the people of Israel are lost in the wilderness. They're lost and they're getting hungry. They've been liberated from slavery in Egypt. God has led them through the Red Sea into freedom. But they don't have anything to eat. They crave the fish, cucumbers, melons, and garlic of Egypt. God hears the people's hunger, and God has compassion for them. It moves God to act. God says to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you. Say to the people, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." In the morning, God sends manna for the people to gather, as much as they need for that day. In the evening, God sends quails for the people to catch, as much as they can eat that night. The next morning, God sends more manna, and the next evening, God sends more quails, again and again for the entire 40 years that Israel is in the wilderness. God feeds and cares for God's people for as long as the people need. The people of Israel come to trust that God will provide for them. Hundreds of years later, the people of Israel are in the wilderness again. They aren't lost this time. They know exactly where they are, in Babylon, the empire that has conquered them and taken them into exile. The people of Israel have lost everything that used to make them who they are: the land, the line of kings descended from David, the temple in Jerusalem. They are afraid that God has abandoned them. They long for home, both the home of their country and the home of their relationship with God. The world at this time is a barter economy. Coins are just coming into use, but only among the very rich. No one else has money. Abundance to ancient people isn't a lot of money, it's a lot of food. So God invites the exiles to a feast. Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. You that have no money, that's all of you. Come, buy food and wine and milk without price. Eat what is good. Delight yourselves in rich food. God isn't just feeding the people. This feast is an expression of God's love for them. God has said it in words. Now God is saying it with olives and cheese. You are mine, always. And because I love you, I care for you. I nourish you, your spirits as well as your bodies. Again, the people come to trust that God will provide for them. Hundreds of years later, Jesus is in the wilderness, sailing by himself along the Sea of Galilee. He's just received crushing news. His cousin and friend, John the Baptist, has been executed by King Herod. Jesus needs time and space on his own to grieve. He doesn't get it, because the crowds that have been following Jesus are grieving and scared too, and they want to be with him. When Jesus comes ashore and sees the crowds, he has compassion for them. So deeply he feels it in his guts. It moves him to action, to heal the sick. When evening comes, Jesus' disciples urge him to send the people home. A crowd can't hide in the wilderness. Herod's goons are going to notice all these people and maybe come after them. And anyway, there isn't much to eat out here. Better, the disciples think, to get everyone home safely. Jesus has other ideas. God feeds people in the wilderness. So Jesus, the Son of God, feeds them too. He asks the disciples to bring what they have, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, next to nothing. Next to nothing is God's favorite thing to work with. Jesus takes the bread and fish, blesses them, breaks them, and gives them to the disciples, and the disciples give them to the people. It seems like so little, but it is plenty. It's more than enough. It is abundance. Fish sandwiches for everyone. 5,000 men, even more women and children. Everyone eats their fill, and there are baskets and baskets of leftovers. Again, God nourishes and cares for God's people. Again, the people come to trust that God will provide for them. Again and again, the sacred stories of our faith tell us that when we are in the wilderness, when we are hungry, God feeds us. God nourishes and cares for us. God provides for our spirits as well as our bodies. Sometimes words aren't enough to assure us of God's love and care. So God sets a feast for us and lets the food do the talking. Manna and quail for the newly freed Israelites, food and milk without price for the exiles, fish and bread for the scared, grieving crowds beside the sea. In the before time, this is the point where I would gesture to the altar and talk about God feeding us through the Eucharist. But when I prayed with these stories of holy meals this year, what stood out to me is how they don't really fit the pattern of the Eucharist. Eucharist is a communal meal of bread and wine, presided over by a priest, that usually, but not always, takes place in a dedicated space. The Israelites and the exiles and the crowds eat where they are, wherever they happen to be. Wine and bread are mentioned, but the menus go beyond that to quail, milk, fish. Moses and Jesus probably qualify as professional religious people, if not priests, but the meal for the exiles comes directly from God. And that made me ask myself, have I been so focused on missing the Eucharist that I haven't noticed all the other times God feeds us? That 4-course lunch that Gilbert made for us, was that not God providing and caring for me in the person of an elderly Frenchman? The homemade cookies and cinnamon rolls that some of you have brought to our house, was that not God nourishing me through the members of St. John's? The festive dinners I've made for family and friends, are they not an expression of God's love for God's people? Maybe I've had a part in this too. Maybe like the disciples we all are, the servers bringing out the lavish feast that God the chef has prepared. Maybe God has been feeding us all along, is feeding us even now, because we are in the wilderness and we are hungry and God loves us. Perhaps that's one of the gifts of this awful year, that God invites us to see every meal as holy, to see every person who feeds us as the server for God the chef, and to see ourselves as God's assistants every time we feed someone else. God nourishes and cares and provides for our bodies and our spirits each time we human beings eat and drink. In the Eucharist, yes, and in every other meal we have. Like that meal you remembered a few minutes ago. the one that left you feeling cared for, fed, nourished. That was God's love for you, spoken through food. God has fed the bodies and spirits of God's people since the beginning. And because God has always fed us, we can trust that God provides for us still.